UK, and they hold a special place in the public's eye, and they generate millions of pounds in tourism from people wanting to visit colonies. They're top predators at the interface between the land and the sea, so they breed on land, but they get their food from the sea. The UK holds internationally important populations, in particular shown on this map in Scotland and in parts of Wales. And very importantly, they're protected by powerful EU legislation through the EU Birds Directive. Now, there's a conservation challenge we're facing at the moment, which is that seabirds, many species of seabirds are facing population declines. So shown here in a table are some examples of quite significant declines in the last 10 or 15 years. In fact, much of the declines date back to the 1980s. The principal cause is thought to be in most cases associated with climate change, in particular bottom-up processes driving changes in the prey base of these birds, and particularly difficult issues in the North Sea and in the Northern Isles of Orkney and Shetland. Fisheries have also been implicated, fisheries for sand eels in particular. I won't say more about fisheries, but I'm happy to talk about that over lunch. And a new potential threat, which you've heard quite a lot about at this meeting, which is marine renewables. Now, I mentioned the declines that have occurred since the 1980s, and in fact it's from the 1980s that we have a very good picture nationwide of the numbers of seabirds that are breeding here. And this is a typical example of a species that's shown substantial declines over the last 30 years. But I was struck by this recurring theme, so I inserted this slide last night about this issue of a baseline. Actually, the 1980s were a historic high. And this is one population which, as you can see, has showed dramatic increases throughout much of the 20th century. So the question of what is our baseline is highly relevant. Now, well, this example is just one, and it's not true to say that there were no seabirds in the UK in 1920. However, there were significantly reduced numbers at that time, largely thought for two reasons. One was a reduction in significant persecution that took place in Victorian times, and the other being the changes in the competitors, in particular the whitefish, which feed on the same things and were reducing in numbers throughout the 20th century. Anyway, I think this is a general picture, which is that the recent declines that we've seen in seabirds are probably in many cases from recent historic highs. Now, the broader context of sustainable economies, we have on our left here the clear biodiversity importance both of the species I'm talking about and the habitats that they inhabit to get their food. And on the other hand, the economic importance, the importance of fisheries, renewable energies, oil and gas exploration, and how we can come to sustainable solutions where protected species conservation is right at the heart of sustainable development on our right here. And then we have additional pressures that underpin all of this already dynamic situation, principally due to climate change and pollution. So the goals of seabird research in that context are really right at the heart of it is a fundamental understanding of their population ecology. We've heard a few times today about the lack of data that makes some of these conservation challenges so tough. Well, that's why we have at the heart of what we're trying to do a good understanding of that. So a classic population ecology study where we're trying to measure demographic rates, by which I mean birth rates, death rates, immigration and emigration, and those are the building blocks for population size. So that's our first main focus, is good estimates of those. And then secondarily, what are the environmental and intrinsic drivers of those demographic rates? Now, in many cases, we're dealing with what are called sublethal effects. Because they're top predators, they tend not to get killed by things, but they tend to have death by 1,000 cuts through changes in their prey base. And this sublethal effect structure is complicated. You have a driver which affects the behavior of the predator and its energetics. Those ultimately affect the demographic rates, which ultimately affect population size. It's a more complicated dynamic than a mortality effect where you jump to demographic rates much more quickly. Now, in the other context here that's associated with this study of population ecology are twofold that I want to address today. One is the scale dependence, which again is a recurring theme, and secondly, integrating seabird ecology into the seascapes. And I want to illustrate that with one example that I coordinate, which is a long-term study on the Isle of May, which is an island just close to here, which started in 1973. We work on 6 species, and we work on all the classic things that I've talked about in a population ecology study. So you've got the demography, the demographic rates, and then those measures that we need to take to understand the underpinning drivers and mechanisms. So the diet, the behavior, and the physiology. And our main research questions are, what are the drivers of population dynamics, and how do seabirds fit into marine spatial planning? So I'll go through those different building blocks that get us to where we think we are now, which is starting with those demographic rates. Now this work splits into 2 classic halves, as all population studies generally do. The first is looking at the population dynamics at the population level. Variation in demographic rates is shown on this lower graph of 5 species, their breeding success, which is their productivity, their birth rates, over the last 30 years, and aspects of synchrony between them. And then an individual-based study. What you can see here on this kittiwake here is colourings on its legs, and we use colourings to build unique combinations so that we can follow individuals through their lives. And population ecology is massively enhanced if you can follow individuals and understand the variation between them. And this isn't just an example shown here of the probability of skipping breeding at the individual level in relation to age. Moving on to some of the drivers that we've witnessed in our system, well, climate change is the one that we've probably focused on most extensively. So the 2 main areas of that are ocean warming and extreme weather. In terms of ocean warming, very much about bottom-up processes, causing changes in productivity, in copepods, the food of sand eels, which themselves are the food of our top predatory seabirds. And some projection work which is showing that projected increases in temperature at the end of this century, causing a reduced fledgling probability. That's a sort of productivity metric in our seabirds. And habitat suitability models showing that they're declining in East Scotland, and Lofoten and South Iceland will become much more suitable in the 2090s, equivalent to the suitability that we're seeing here now. So very much a northern shift in suitability. Extreme weather events is very much going up the agenda. It's something that rings very true with the general public, much more so than warming, especially in this country. It's something we all see, and it's really has the potential to have a big effect on seabirds through direct mortality events. We've had some recent ones recently that affect both the summer breeding performance and some of these population wrecks of adults in winter. Now, this is high on the agenda, of course, because models are suggesting that the severity and frequency is set to increase in future. Now, the second driver I wanted to talk about was effects of marine renewables. We've worked quite extensively on the effects of offshore wind farms, because in our system here, just close to the Isle of May, we have various proposed wind farms. This is quite an old map, and various among these, that one and that one, are no longer being considered. But these 2, number 9 and 7, and this little corner of the purple one, are all being considered for development as wind farms. Now, wind farms have the potential, interestingly, the point made earlier by Merriweather about we tend to focus on negative effects. There are potentially some positive effects of wind farms, but most of the focus is indeed on negative effects, of which there are really 2. Collision risk from turbines, and displacement, which is where birds are reluctant to enter the footprint of the wind farm and are displaced potentially from favoured foraging habitats. Just very briefly to touch on tidal and wave as well, many of our seabirds are diving species, and in particular tidal turbines at depth will be faced with many of the same questions. Now, the issue really is that there's a lack of strong evidence about the potential effects of these devices on seabirds. And that's because they simply haven't been positioned in the places where our seabirds operate. And what we've been building is these models of potential effects, again, of displacement. Again, the classic sublethal model where we have a driver which is displacement from seabirds. How does that affect their behavior? Knock-on effects on their energetics, demographic rates and population size. And we're seeing potential significant effects a lot of this data, I should say, is parameterized by tracking data of breeding adults, which enables us to get maps of where they are at sea, and then we can model what would be the effect if they're displaced from particular footprints. Talking briefly about scale dependence, it's a huge issue in the context of what we're trying to do. Here are just summer foraging distributions of central place foraging birds, which are operating out of colonies and repeatedly returning to them. They will actually be operating at massively different scales. These are two moderately similar sized species, shags with a foraging range of 15 kilometres, and gannets with a foraging range of up to 500 kilometres. So you can imagine the issues are much stronger, are very different between the two. Then in winter, some species are actually migrating to the Labrador Sea. So that opens up a whole new international context. Finally, I think the natural next step for us, and that's what we're doing right now, is looking at the metapopulation dynamics. So rather than just focusing on the Isle of May, we now have a citizen science project where we're marking birds right up the coast and then monitoring their migration strategies in winter. And again, in the context of seascapes, understanding the metapopulation dynamics and movements of these highly mobile species is critically important. And that then allows us to feed very much into the two main sort of policy drivers that we're all very familiar with. One is the issue of marine protection, and secondly, that of sustainable economic development of things like marine renewables and oil and gas. So you have this classic melting pot of fisheries, renewables, conservation and tourism, building into marine spatial planning, the issue of cumulative effects, which have been touched on already, and then this concept of a dynamic policy, given that we're facing significant environmental change. So just to conclude, seabirds are an integral part of seascapes. Critically important, we think, is an understanding of population dynamics. It's fundamentally important to have good, strong, basic ecological data, including underpinning drivers and scale of at-sea usage. And this provides a strong foundation for sustainable development integrated with conservation of protected species. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think that's a fantastic talk to connect a lot of the dots that we've been talking about.